All right, folks, it's Back in action here. In this video, we are going to go through the properties of parallelograms and rectangles. We're going to look at them both from a visual perspective, marking up a diagram, and then we're also going to list them. Now, if you're a student in my class, you have this in a front-back form, so your property list will be on the back side of your flashcard form, and the pictures will be on the front, so they won't be side to side for you. You'll have to flip it over. So I'm going to first go through the properties on the picture so that we can just mark all that up, and then you guys can flip it over and we'll write them on the back. All right, here on the front, we've got many properties of a parallelogram. There are 5 particular properties, many of which you are already familiar with. So we'll start off with the definition. The definition of a parallelogram says that the opposite sides are going to be parallel. So we're going to mark that first. We're going to give ourselves our nice parallel lines. We're also going to remember to use a different set of arrows on each set of parallel lines. The next property of a parallelogram is not from a definition. It could be developed using triangle proofs from the first semester, and that property is going to tell us that the opposite sides are congruent. So the top and bottom are going to be congruent to each other, and the left and the right are going to be congruent to each other. Now you'll notice that I right now have all the same number of tick marks. I'm going to go back. I'm going to put 2 tick marks on the top and bottom, and all of my 1 tick mark on the left and the right. Now, another property is that since these lines are parallel, we'll have our parallel lines and they'll be cut by a transversal no matter which way you look at it. So the consecutive angles in the parallelogram are going to be supplementary. That's simply because you have consecutive interior angles anytime you have a pair of consecutive sides. Now, this one's going to be a little bit harder for us to mark, so I'm going to just do a little coloring here, and I'm going to kind of color this big angle and this big angle right here, and then we'll write ourselves a note that these are going to be supplementary, and it won't matter which pair of consecutive sides you choose. The next thing that we're going to look at is that the opposite angles are going to be congruent to each other. So we can use traditional congruent markings like that. You could also use colored dots. So I'm going to have my congruent angles and my congruent angles. The last one that we're going to do is we're going to draw in the diagonals. And this is going to be a little bit harder for me because I'm trying to do this on my iPad. But I'm going to draw in these diagonals. And the diagonals of a parallelogram will bisect each other, which means this point right here where they intersect is going to be a midpoint of each diagonal. So now I'm going to have these 2 pieces are congruent. Notice I'm using 3 tick marks because I've already used the 1 and 2. And then the remaining 2 pieces are congruent to each other, and I've got 4 tick marks on that. Now, when it comes to a rectangle, again, we're going to mark up all the pictures first, and then you'll flip it over and do the back side. On the rectangle is a parallelogram, so all of these properties that we listed here for the parallelogram would apply to the rectangle. Now, I'm not going to mark all of them because our picture is going to get a little bit too crazy if we mark them all. We're going to mark some key ones for us. A rectangle, by definition, is a parallelogram that has 4 right angles. And you might want to pause it and write that down. The rectangle is a parallelogram that has 4 right angles. So our definition would tell us then that we would need to put these right angles in here. Notice that by putting those right angles in there, we're automatically indicating the opposite angles are congruent to each other and our consecutive angles are supplementary. That's why I was saying we don't really need to mark everything. We could mark the top and the bottom and the left and the right as congruent. That doesn't hurt to remind ourselves that those are going to be congruent. The rectangle has one very, very unique property, and that's that beyond the definition, and that's that the diagonals are actually going to be congruent to each other. Now, we could prove this through a triangle proof again, or you could even just give yourself just a little reminder and just measure the rectangle that I have there in your picture. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to draw in these diagonals. If you've got a straight edge there at home, it would probably be good for you to draw that in. Now, we're going to marry this idea of the diagonals congruent with the fact that the diagonals bisect each other. if they're both congruent and bisect each other, instead of having this set of congruent pieces and this set of congruent pieces, all 4 pieces are going to be the same. So I'm going to give 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And what I want to draw your attention to here is that this triangle right here, in fact, any of these little interior triangles are going to be isosceles triangles now. I also want to remind you that we can draw our attention to the right triangles that are going to be happening here. And I'm going to have a right triangle anytime we look at this diagonal here in the sides. All right, now let's just flip it over real quick. If you're at home, go ahead, flip it over, and we're going to list out the properties in words. So number 1, on a parallelogram, we are going to say, this is from our definition, that both pairs of the opposite sides are parallel. The next, we want to remind ourselves then that the consecutive angles are going to be supplementary. Next, we're going to say, I'm going to use an abbreviation BP for both pairs. Both pairs of the opposite sides are also congruent. We can also say that both pairs of the opposite angles are congruent. And we can say that the diagonals bisect each other. Now, I have these front and back for you because you need to have them memorized and committed to memory in both ways. You need to visually have it committed to your memory so you could mark it, and you need to be able to list and identify the properties. That's why I have these front and back on your form. On the rectangle, we're going to give ourselves a reminder that it has all the parallelogram properties. And I'm going to abbreviate parallelogram, Pgram. All the parallelogram properties. Then we're going to remind ourselves the definition of the rectangle, and that was that it had 4 right angles. And then we're going to remind ourselves that the diagonals are now congruent. I've got another note here to remind ourselves that the triangles, each of the interior triangles, are going to be isosceles, and that each part of the diagonal will be congruent. Okay, so all the parts of the diagonal are congruent. So you want to spend some time practicing and just starting to commit these to memory because similar to our many of our last chapters, these are things you are going to need to be able to recall very quickly.